Hello, and thank you all for joining today's webinar with Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy and the Institute's Center for the Middle East. My name is Colton Cox, and I am the Policy Assistant to Ambassador Edward Djerejian, the Director of the Baker Institute, who will be today's speaker. This webinar is part of the Baker Institute's 2020 election series that highlights critical policy issues ahead of the November presidential election. In the realm of foreign policy, the Middle East has been and will certainly remain a central challenge. A future Trump or Biden administration could take vastly different approaches toward the Middle East and North Africa. And because of this, the ambassador will be putting into context the key issues in the region that will persist no matter who takes office. Ambassador Djerejian has dealt with U.S. Middle East policy throughout his career, serving under 8 different presidential administrations from John F. Kennedy to Bill Clinton. After retiring from the Foreign Service and as director of the Baker Institute, he continues to be heavily involved in a range of Middle East policy matters. Following his remarks, the ambassador will respond to your questions, and we encourage you all to submit them throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature. Thank you all once again for joining, and I will now hand it over to Ambassador Djerejian. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Colton. I would like to give a brief overview of what I see as the most important challenges the United States faces in the broader Middle East. Whoever is elected to the presidency on November 3rd, there is no doubt, as history has shown, that his administration will be obligated by the sheer force of events to focus on the Middle East. To understand where the Middle East stands today, we need to recall the tectonic shift that swept across the region almost a decade ago, namely the Arab uprisings, also called the Arab Spring. These uprisings were popular revolts against systemic deficiencies across the Arab world, revealing that millions of citizens were simply fed up. The placards that many of the demonstrators displayed had the Arabic word kafaya, enough. Enough of the lack of political participation, enough of corruption, enough of all their grievances. But like many popular revolts, they were quickly suppressed by the powers they be, except in Tunisia. Today, we still see manifestations of this popular discontent continuing to have a major impact throughout the Arab world. You can see it in excruciating detail in Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, and also Algeria. The protests in Lebanon go so much deeper than just anger at the incompetence of the government for not ensuring public safety in the wake of the horrific Beirut port explosion on August 4th. There is visceral resentment across swaths of Lebanon's people toward the corruption, negligence, and divisive sectarianism that has colored Lebanese society for such a long time. The key challenge that has faced Lebanon for decades is whether it can redefine its multi-confessional character into a viable nation state, where the people identify with the nation and not primarily with their confessional base. This is the fundamental issue that is manifest in the mass protests calling for structural reforms that Lebanon is witnessing at this critical juncture in its history. Will the protesters be a catalyst for structural change or a modified status quo? In sum, are they a watershed or a brief passing moment within the broader arc of Lebanon's history? The Baker Institute is taking this issue on because it has important consequences for the region as a whole. Iraq is the most important Arab client state for leaders in Tehran. It is Iran's bridge to the Arab world. Iran will exploit political instability in Iraq for its own ends. At the same time, there are nationalist forces in Iraq that do not want to be dominated by Iran and are struggling to form an independent and representative nation state. That is a major reason why the Iranian regime is so invested in Iraq. Even in wealthy Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, certain economic and political reforms that they have instituted can be traced to the Arab uprisings. They have to keep ahead of the Arab street. These monarchies are aware that they are not totally immune to the currents moving across the Arab world in which citizens long for greater political participation and economic opportunity. Now, here we should also focus, as a matter of U.S. policy, on the indigenous role of Islamist political parties and organizations in the broader Middle East. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, Ennahda in Tunisia, the AKP in Turkey, and other Islamist political parties. At the extreme end of these Islamic movements are Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, Al-Shabaab. And these are the extremist groups, which are really the generators of terrorism and instability. The Sunni-Shia split has become even more pronounced in the Middle East. The September 2019 attacks on the state-owned Aramco oil processing facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia and the assassination by the United States of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in early 2020 underscore the dangers inherent in the situation and the risk of possible military confrontation in the Gulf region. The Iranian threat is there, and it heavily colors the politics of the region. It is a major reason why some of the Gulf countries are looking to normalize relations with Israel that would not have been possible in the 1970s. Now, of course, the U.S. role plays a major role in all of these dynamics in the Gulf. President Trump's administration has withdrawn from the Obama administration's negotiated nuclear agreement with Iran, the JCPOA. The IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard movement, has come into more prominence in Iranian politics. They have become stronger and more militant. And the United States is imposing one sanction after another on almost a daily basis against the Iranian regime and Iranian political personalities and military personalities. At the same time, President Trump episodically says he wants to do a deal with the Iranian regime and would be willing to talk. So you have this sort of dichotomy in U.S. policy toward Iran that has continued to play out throughout the Trump administration. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad has proven his staying power, contrary to all the prophets of doom who said otherwise. He's propped up by Iran and Russia for their own ends. But what has he reaped? His grasp on political power? Absolutely yes. He remains in power. But he presides over a truncated state with millions of internally displaced and externally displaced Syrian refugees, with Russia, Iran, and Turkey, and yes, the United States present militarily and politically on Syrian territory. So the task of diplomacy in Syria is to get the parties to the Geneva negotiating table to map out a political transition. In my view, the United States, beyond humanitarian assistance, should not commit the U.S. taxpayers' money to the reconstruction costs in Syria while Russia, Iran, and Turkey hold sway in the country and Bashar al-Assad's regime does not commit to a viable political transition. Now, what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria, and the Obama administration did not quite grasp this, and Trump is absolutely committed to reducing even further our minimal troop presence there. This civil war has had a disruptive impact not only on the Syrian people, but it has even affected transatlantic relations, and it obviously affects United States interests. I remember mentioning to Lionel Barber, the former editor-in-chief of the Financial Times, I asked Lionel, I said, with all your expertise, especially on British politics, did the Syrian civil war and the refugee exodus have anything to do with Brexit? And without flinching, Lionel said, absolutely. The perception of thousands and thousands of Arabs refugees entering into Europe was part of the rationale for the Brexiteers to proceed on that policy goal. In Afghanistan, in terms of the broader Middle East, the U.S. brokered negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban are underway as we speak. The agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan was signed by the United States and the head of the political office of the Taliban, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, in February of this year. And what the agreement outlines is armed groups will be prevented by the Taliban and the Afghan government security forces from using Afghanistan as a base for acts against the United States and its allies. Now, this is a key requirement for the United States because let's not forget the reason we went into Afghanistan militarily after 9/11 was to overthrow the Taliban, which was giving safe haven to Al-Qaeda, which attacked us on our homeland in 9/11. So this is a key requirement. Foreign forces, another condition of this agreement, will withdraw from Afghanistan, including U.S. troops and contractors and coalition forces. So the United States is committed to withdrawing all of its military forces, as well as those of its allies and partners, within 14 months of signing of this agreement. But pending the Taliban's demonstration of commitment to the agreement, and that is still a question mark. Another part of this agreement is the initiation of internal Afghan negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban. The agenda for intra-Afghan negotiations will include discussion of how to implement a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire and a political roadmap for the future of Afghanistan. Now, this political roadmap is tricky because the U.S. and the Taliban have agreed that they seek a post-settlement Afghan Islamic government. The nature and character and constitutional order of that Islamic form of government is going to have to be worked out. So while the good news is that these intra-Afghanistan negotiations have been initiated, there is much work yet to be done. Now, I think you've all seen a lot of reporting on the U.S. military presence in the Middle East and that we're withdrawing from the Middle East. And what a lot of commentators are missing in this is that, yes, President Trump wants to get out of Syria. He's reducing our forces there in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he has made absolutely clear that he does not like the trend of never-ending wars. But let me state that the U.S. physically is not withdrawing from the Middle East. We need to look at the big picture. The U.S. still has many bases and military facilities in and around the Middle East, ensuring, since 1949, the free flow of energy and commerce through the Straits of Hormuz. Our military power is still manifest, but it matters what we do to translate that military power into coherent and effective policies that address our national security and foreign policy objectives. I have a fact sheet here that I won't go into because of our limited time, but there are about 60,000 total U.S. troops in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Djibouti. So that is the key question. How do we use this military power as a backdrop to our foreign policy? This will be a big question for the next U.S. administration, whoever that might be. I'll briefly comment on the energy sector, which is so important in the Middle East, because our Center for Energy Studies, I refer you to the excellent work that they've been doing over the past months on the energy situation globally, but also on the Middle East. Earlier this year, we also witnessed a competitive power play between Saudi Arabia and Russia that impacted the global economy and sent oil prices down to new lows. Saudi Arabia, according to the conventional wisdom, needs to have about $80 oil per barrel to balance its budgetary needs. But given the volatility of oil and gas prices and the global economic challenges of COVID-19, wealthy Gulf economies painfully realize that they cannot remain dependent on fossil fuel revenues forever. The need to diversify their economies and institute reforms are compelling. It is also important that the United States has become the world's top producer of oil due to the shale revolution. We are no longer as reliant as we have been on Middle East oil as in the past. And that is a game-changing political shift. Let me turn to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Much ink has been spilled about Israel's recent agreements with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain that were signed at the White House with much fanfare last week. Let me be upfront that on a basic level, I believe any normalization between Israel and an Arab state is a good thing. But these peace for peace agreements, not land for peace agreements, are basically transactional and fall short of what a comprehensive solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict should be based upon. I worry that they will serve as a model in the future that are not grounded in the fundamental issue of land for peace, which is the only valid formula for real peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Bibi Netanyahu did not have to make any major concession. He did say he would stop annexation of the West Bank, but then when back in Israel, he said it isn't off the table. But settlement activities continue, the occupation continues, and so does the intermittent violence on Israel's southern border with Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist group. There is also always the potential for an eruption of violence on the northern border with Israel and the border with Lebanon. In my last visits to Israel, the briefings I heard from the Israeli Defense Forces emphasized their concern over a threat of war with Hezbollah, which would involve Lebanon as a whole. It's a dangerous and fragile situation on Israel's northern border and in southern Lebanon. Also, beyond the situation around Israel, which is quite destabilizing along the lines I'm outlining, even inside Israel, you are seeing deep discontent with the government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. They've gone into another lockdown. The indictments against Prime Minister Netanyahu for breach of trust, accepting bribes and fraud, and economic and social issues are paramount. Israel, unfortunately, is quite divided today internally, and the government is not functioning efficiently. On the Arab side, there's no consensus in the Arab world on this issue of normalization of relations with Israel. The Arab League could not even meet and come out with a consensus statement regarding the deals with the UAE and Bahrain. And look very closely at the difference in tone and substance between what the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, says and what King Salman, the King of Saudi Arabia, says, who's more traditionalist on this issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The traditional Saudi position is to respect the 2002 Saudi Peace Initiative, which they sponsored early on and have adhered to ever since. And that basically says that once Israel makes peace with the Palestinians and its Arab neighbors, all the Arab countries of the Arab League will normalize relations with Israel. Now, what's happened last week is that consensus view has been broken by two Arab states, the UAE and Bahrain, and we'll see if more come into that framework. So having served on both the Arab and the Israeli side in my diplomatic career, I've always been a staunch advocate of Israel living side by side with an independent Palestinian state. But I see that the very existence of Israel as a democratic Jewish state, which it wants to be, is being threatened by avoiding the principle of land for peace. Yes, Israel can keep living with the occupation. It has since 1967. But in the long term, that is simply not sustainable or acceptable for Israelis or Palestinians. There's a reputable Palestinian pollster, Khalil Shikaki, who points out that a growing number of Palestinian youth rejects a two-state solution. They're saying, why should we have another Arab state called Palestine? In the long run, they would like to become citizens of an Israeli state, preferably with equal rights. But most likely, there'll be a distinction between Israeli and Palestinian citizens, which can grow to accusations of apartheid. In the long run, the Arab demographics in such a one state will outpace the Jewish demographic growth. Simply put, there'll be more Arabs than Israelis. Also, the PLO and the Palestinian National Authority have not demonstrated effective leadership. It looks like they have no coherent strategy. The aging leaders have shown an inability to define a coherent negotiating framework in the face of Trump's deal of the century and in terms of these normalization agreements. If I were to recommend a course of action to the next administration, it is that the two-state solution, based on the principle of land for peace, should be the way forward. Jared Kushner says we should focus on the facts of the ground. That's realism, he says. But the Palestinians will never accept the facts on the ground and the formula of the deal of the century. So if the land for peace formula is rejected, the path for a one-state solution, as I mentioned, either equal rights or apartheid state, will prevail. And I think this will undermine the principle of a democratic Jewish state. Let me conclude, before we take your questions. The Middle East will always be a region of strategic interest for the United States. And I've attempted to outline here some of the enduring challenges and considerations that our nation must face as it engages with this part of the world. Indeed, there are no easy solutions to any of these issues. We need to adopt a coherent and comprehensive policy approach to this region and connect the dots, understand the fundamental political, socioeconomic, and cultural issues at play, and adopt an effective public diplomacy strategy to explain our interests, values, and purpose in the Middle East. Thank you, and I will now take your questions.
Thank you for that overview. The first question centers around an address that you gave last month on the crisis in Lebanon, specifically after the tragic explosion that struck the port of Beirut. Could you speak more about the popular unrest that we're currently witnessing in Lebanon and what needs to occur for Lebanon to have a brighter future? Also, if you could also speak about the overall importance of Lebanese stability for the broader Middle East region.
That's a good question. Lebanon has been put up as the model for multi-confessional existence in the Arab world, where you have Muslims and Christians. And when I was assigned to Lebanon, the Jewish community and the Druze all living in peacefully, one next to the other. And it was a burgeoning society in the 50s and 60s and was a model of entrepreneurship, as I said, multi-confessional coexistence, a political system that was not that efficient but worked. And it was a financial center. It was a political center. It was a cultural center. All of that is now totally at risk and being undermined by the systemic corruption of the Lebanese regime. I've used the word regime, not only the government. After the brutal civil war, 1975-1990 in Lebanon, the warlords just, became politicians and oligarchs and used the government as a bank depository. Each sect was saying, okay, the Shiites should control the Ministry of Finance, as they're now arguing as we speak today, or the Maronite Christians should control this ministry, the other, etc. That systemic corruption was brought to horrific light on the August 4th explosion at the Beirut port. Just think of all those thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate that was sitting there under no supervision, no controls, and just exploded and caused this devastating damage. If anyone could create a symbol for where this corrupt regime has led the country, it was that. So I think the only answer is systemic change to all the systemic corruption. And I think they need radical constitutional reforms. And as I said in my remarks, they have to establish a national identity that prevails over their more narrow conventional identities. But the regime and the people who are in power, who are still in power, are very reluctant to let go of that. So the big question is whether or not the protesters will be able, or this political consensus, especially amongst the youth in Lebanon, will be able to prevail to change the system. And if they do, that will be a tremendous, I think, positive step forward for the region as a whole. But many odds might be against it. And we may see Lebanon truly become, it's a failing state now, but it may become categorically a failed state if things go wrong. And we have to address the issue of Hezbollah. Hezbollah, political and military influence in Lebanon is very important. It's the only political grouping that was allowed to maintain militia with arms in the Taif Accords that ended the Lebanese Civil War in 1990. And that was a strategic factor, a negative one, that allows Hezbollah to have so much influence in Lebanon today. And on the one hand, this is simplifying the situation, but the protests that are asking and demanding for systemic change are going to have to deal with the Hezbollah factor in a major way. And remember, Iran is behind Hezbollah also, because Iran sees Hezbollah as one of its arms and legs into the Arab world and on the border of Israel.
And on that note, Ambassador, another burning question about the upcoming November election involves how a Trump versus Biden administration will approach the issue of Iran. So Trump's presidency, as we know, has been marked by a maximum pressure approach toward Iran. And if Biden were to be elected, there's a possibility that he would seek to return to some form of the JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal that President Trump exited in 2017. So what exactly are some of the crucial differences between how a Trump or Biden administration would approach the Iranian threat?
Well, if Trump is reelected, I think we're going to see more of the maximizing of pressure on Iran. And we're going to see this dichotomy between what the State Department and maybe the Defense Department is saying, and then what Trump is saying in one of his press briefings that, oh yeah, I'd be ready to sit down with the Iranian leadership because I think it can make a deal. Remember, Trump really feels that he can make deals if he is the major actor dealing one-on-one with the leadership in countries. We saw that with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. It didn't work. There were some signs of progress, but it failed. So we'll see that dichotomy and these two contrary strands of policy in the Trump administration proceeding. The Iranians have made very clear just recently that if Biden is elected and wants to reestablish the JCPOA that President Obama made one of his major foreign policy initiatives. And frankly, I support the JCPOA because I think that given the alternatives, it did restrict Iran's nuclear development capabilities in a real way. What people forget is that Iran had a few months capability of building a bomb. With the JCPOA, that timeline was expanded to several years, with intrusive IAEA inspections. Yes, the time period was limited for the agreement as a whole, and they could have reverted, but we had a window where we could negotiate with the Iranian regime on all these other issues that are valid, ballistic missiles, their really bad behavior in the region as a whole. But we had a diplomatic window that while their nuclear capabilities were being capped. That's why I supported the deal. The Trump administration rejected the deal for all the reasons that they've stated. So I think it's going to be very difficult, even if Biden is elected, because the foreign minister of Iran, Zarif, has just recently stated that they're not going to automatically go back to point one and restore the agreement. They will also have new demands. So even if Biden is president, those negotiations with Iran are going to be difficult.
Ambassador, you've also spoken at length about the recent normalization agreements between Israel and certain Arab states. But in terms of the U.S.'s own relationship with Israel, what might U.S. policy toward Israel look like under a potential Biden administration? And to put it more fine-tuned, how has Israel perhaps become more of a partisan issue in recent years?
Well, unfortunately, Israel has now become a partisan issue in the United States. The American Jewish community, we're seeing for the first time in many years, has some major divisions over policy toward Israel, especially on annexation and on Bibi Netanyahu's government. So you have, it's sort of like a liberal or conservative strands in terms of their opinion toward the U.S. policy toward Israel. I think under a Biden administration, Biden made it very clear that he's an advocate of the two-state solution, which I also support. But he will be inheriting quite a different political landscape than when he and Obama left office. Because during the Trump administration, they've extended sovereignty over the Golan Heights. They've moved the embassy to Jerusalem. They've recognized virtually potential sovereignty over the West Bank. And they're talking about Israel reigning over 30% of the West Bank. And now the normalization agreements that are not based really on land for peace, despite what some of the Arab parties claim to be, but it's really subsumed. It's really peace for peace. It's not land for peace. But I think Biden will gravitate more toward the traditional approach on land for peace. And I think there'll be some static in U.S.-Israeli relations because of that. If Netanyahu is still prime minister, as I mentioned, he's under indictment. He's in a very serious domestic situation, not only the litigations against him, but with COVID and the economic issues that he has to face. So it's not going to be easy, but what the Trump administration has succeeded in doing, whether one likes it or not, is that they've shifted the landscape. So whoever becomes president is going to have to deal with this new landscape. And in many ways, it complicates matters.
Looking to another national context, we have a question about the U.S.-Turkey relationship. Could you speak some about how the U.S.-Turkey relationship has been colored under Trump's administration, and what you think might be possible ways forward, especially under Erdogan's very assertive foreign policy?
Well, there's now a great deal of static between U.S.-Turkish relations, and it's devolved, really. When you think about it, when Erdogan came into power, he was sort of the poster boy of an Islamist leader heading the AKP party, reigning and governing over a very secular state, Turkey, and promoting private entrepreneurship, and the Turkish economy was going. And he was looked upon as a model where an Islamist leader can come and rule a Muslim-majority country along the lines of Kemal Atatürk, the father of the modern Turkish state. Erdogan has leaned much more toward his Islamist base and has become less democratic and much more autocratic in the way he governs Turkey now. And his foreign policy has become much more assertive and points very aggressive, be it in Libya, be it in Syria. One of his major concerns is the Kurdish issue, and that's why he's involved in Syria, because Turkey is very concerned about Kurdish irredentism and how that can impact on the territorial integrity of Turkey. So that's his major impetus in Syria, is because of that. U.S.-Turkish relations are also complicated by the Gulen movement. You have the leader of that movement who resides in the United States, and Turkey has asked the United States to extradite him for years, and we have not done that. So the U.S.-Turkish relationship is complicated. It's been made more difficult by Turkey's growing relations with Russia, purchase of Russian arms. Let's not forget, Turkey is a major NATO ally, and we have a huge base in Turkey in Incirlik. So the stakes are very, very high. The other last thing I'll mention is Erdogan is supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood movements, which puts him in opposition to the Gulf countries, the Saudis and the UAE especially, who are very concerned about the growth of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Arab world.
And looking at the Gulf, and specifically the wealthy, oil-rich nations of the Gulf, could you speak more? You touched on it when you were discussing U.S. Less of U.S. dependence on energy in the Gulf, but could you speak more about some of the enduring economic challenges that these wealthy Gulf nations might face since they have been so dependent on petrochemical revenues?
Well, it's an extremely serious challenge. The Saudis, let's just concentrate on the Saudis for a moment. They were so lucky to have such great oil wealth that they could pay off many of their problems, both domestically and giving subsidies to their citizens, providing them with housing, providing them with education, providing them with a good life, if you will. But with the volatility of the energy sector and the decrease in oil prices and the emerging role of emerging technologies in the energy sector, it's become very apparent that in order for Saudi Arabia to move forward for its future generations, they have to institute structural reforms. And this is true for all the Gulf states. So they're in a real bind in terms of the low price of energy today and how they can meet their budgetary and reform goals. MBS has established this very ambitious program of 2030, and creating Neom, this high-tech city on the coast of the Red Sea coast, and then a resort area in another part, and instituting certain reforms, socioeconomic reforms. But let's face it, he is not instituting political reforms. Saudi Arabia remains as much a monarchy today as ever. So there's a sharp division between political reforms and economic and socioeconomic reforms in the country. Now, Saudi Arabia is a very important Arab state, along, I would say, like with Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Those have been the two major Arab states for obvious reasons. So I think the future of U.S.-Saudi relations will remain important. I think the reform movement is well needed, but there are some serious issues there. For example, the Jamal Khashoggi killing. Still the fact that there are Saudi women who are incarcerated because of their advocacy of human rights and women's rights. And the war in Yemen. Let's not forget that the Saudi and UAE-backed war in Yemen and the Iranian-backed war in Yemen, with the Houthis, has been an incredible financial drain on their budget. So they're dealing with some very, very serious issues. But the future will only be secured by the diversification of their economies, and not only internally, but regionally. I think there has to be a diversification of the economies of the Gulf. So they can trade with one another more. So these are key issues that they face, and that's one of the reasons that they all feel fragile. The leaderships in all these countries have a sense of fragility, and I can understand why.
Well, you've discussed these internal political dynamics that are occurring within these wealthy Gulf nations, but if we look at relations between these Gulf nations, one of the crucial issues we think of is the rift with Qatar, the GCC dispute that began several years ago. And recently we've seen statements from Secretary Pompeo himself saying that it's past time to resolve this dispute. So what do you see as the future of Qatar's role vis-a-vis its place in the broader Gulf Cooperation Council?
Well, Qatar, as a very small country, has played a role well beyond its size. But financially, it's very important. It's one of the greatest natural gas producers in the world. And it has evolved in many ways, with Education City as a center of learning and education in the Arab world. It has instituted a lot of technological reforms and innovation. And also, it's interesting, Qatar was one of the first Arab Gulf states to have the Israelis establish a trade office there. That's forgotten about now in this normalization. I remember bumping into the Israeli trade representative when I was in Doha in a trip years ago, and also meeting Yitzhak Rabin's son in Doha at a conference. So it's had a very dynamic role despite its size in the region. And one of the instruments of that role is Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, which they created years ago, has proven to be one of the most effective communication arms in the whole Middle East, and especially in the Arab world. I remember when I was first assigned to Damascus back in 1988, I'd go home from the embassy and turn on the local Arabic Syrian news, and it was something out of the medieval ages. You'd have a portly gentleman reading from a prepared script approved by the government, preceded by martial music in the beginning, showing how the Syrians almost won the war of Yom Kippur. And it was really just spoon-fed propaganda. And all of a sudden, something like Al Jazeera appears on the scene. And it was a shock to have an Arab satellite channel having correspondence throughout the world and in Israel, and doing real-time interviews and breaking news. And here it went into the millions of Arab households. And this is Qatar. And of course, then you have the Saudis have Al Arabiya, the UAE, there are various channels. So Qatar's role, despite its small size, is quite important. I think this rift, I think the Gulf countries are shooting themselves in the foot on this rift. They should resolve their differences on it. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are very concerned over Qatar's support of Muslim Brotherhood. I think that is an area where they have to sit down and agree to disagree on certain areas, but they certainly should find enough common ground to come in agreement and solidify their forces. If the Gulf states are that concerned about Iran, they should be unified. And if you look at our military presence, I mentioned the countries in which we have military forces. It's not in the U.S. interest that the Gulf states remain divided. And I know that the Trump administration has been trying to heal that rift. And I hope either Trump or Biden, they continue intelligent American diplomacy to heal that rift, because it doesn't serve the interests of the countries as a whole, the region, and even the Iranian issue. In fact, it's detrimental to presenting a more unified face to Iran in the region.
To turn back to the question of Syria, we have a member who says that Syria has not been as frequently in the news. We know that ISIS's territorial grip on their caliphate has greatly decreased in the past several years. And on one hand, the government of Bashar al-Assad, this regime is already consolidating more power. But we know that, as we've mentioned, the conflict is still very much ongoing. It is still very much not a functioning state, and there are still great issues with the Assad regime, coupled with the instability in Lebanon. Their fundamental question is, how do you foresee the U.S. helping in the Levant without getting ourselves into a worse regional position?
Right. Well, you don't want to. I would not like to see the United States get involved in the internal dynamics of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again in Syria. I think the United States, if I had any recommendation to the incoming administration, be it Trump or Biden, would be focus on the diplomatic effort for a political transition in Syria. Put the backing of the U.S. power and influence with our European allies, and bring the Russians in on it, because they have a major stake, and we've been cooperating with them and coordinating with them in the past on the Syrian question. get that so-called Geneva initiative, get those talks started for a political transition. Because I don't see any hope for Syria without ultimately a political transition into a country in which the people are broadly represented. That is not the case today. And again, as I said in my remarks, I would not recommend that the United States put taxpayers' money into the reconstruction of Syria as long as the Russians and the Turks and the Iranians are playing their political games in Syria for their own ends that are not necessarily in accord with U.S. interests. So having said all that, I would say that the U.S. should concentrate on political strategy, continue humanitarian assistance, because it's a humanitarian disaster. And we have a moral obligation that I think we're living up to. But use the influence we have, and we have a modicum of troops in eastern Syria, but use whatever influence we have to get the parties to the table. But then play an effective diplomatic role at that table, not just convene, but it'll take a lot of diplomacy and political will. So that's what I would recommend on the way forward.
You raised the question of Russia's involvement in the Middle East, and this also speaks to a broader theme that policymakers should consider, and that is the more assertive role of non-Western powers such as Russia and China. We know they each have their own designs for the region that differ from those traditionally espoused by the U.S., and particularly with Russia and China also being heavily politically charged issues in the United States. What do you think is the future of both of these powers in the region?
I think they're limited. A lot of ink is being spilled on the growing power of Russia and the growing power of China in the region. Again, let's go back to basics. We have 60,000 troops in and around the region. They don't come close to that. Russia has a naval base in Latakia and in Syria, and the Chinese are extending their Silk Road, and as you know, their foreign policy is largely driven by what I call the quest for commodities and minerals and energy. But the more they get involved in the region, the more they're going to have to get involved politically. And they're not very good at that. And so, yes, the role of Russia and China has expanded in the Middle East, as ours has diminished to a certain extent politically, but not militarily, again. So I think Russia is constrained by its own rather dismal domestic economic situation and its capacity to really be a superpower, as some Russian nationalists who decried the demise of the Soviet Union. They're not there anymore. So their means are limited. But I think Putin is playing a weak hand very cleverly. And I think we're playing a very strong hand very poorly in the region as a whole. And it's time to come where we've shown that capacity in the past for American diplomacy to begin to look at the facts, look at the data, understand the cultures we're dealing with in this region, and then elaborate foreign policy and national security policy that accords to our interests and to our values. That can be done. But you need to step back and strategize. In a way, you have to reestablish George Kennan's policy planning bureau in the State Department and have some people in Washington looking at the big picture and connecting all these dots in the region so we have a coherent strategy in the region as a whole. Touching on all the things I mentioned in my presentation. We're not doing that. Well, our policy is mostly now reactive. So to answer this question, yes, Russia and China, their influence is growing for the reasons I've stated, but fundamentally they don't have the capacity that certainly we have to really be a major force that all of a sudden, you have some sort of post-colonial era where Russia and China are dominant in the Middle East, and England, France, and the United States no longer are. We should forget about the colonial period. It's over. that period has done enough harm. And we should be crafting strategies now that, in the first instance, as Americans, resound to our national interests, but then serve the interests of the region as a whole.
That's a good stepping stone to another question, which concerns the U.S.'s role in the Middle East vis-a-vis our transatlantic relations. So we know that, of course, within the European Union, we have so many strong allies, though we also know that there are sometimes divergences in the foreign policy priorities between the United States and European countries in terms of the Middle East. So looking into the next several years, what do you think will be some of the key challenges in how, as you mentioned, how we formulate sound policy alongside our European allies?
It's a good question, and it's a difficult one to answer, but there are major divisions between the U.S. and European countries on the Middle East. Iran is a major example of that, where Germany and France, for example, two of our closest allies, we have major differences with them on Iran and the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. We've alienated them by our maximizing sanctions and not engaging and walking away from the JCPOA. And it's rather demonstrative to see that in the United Nations just this past week, where we had virtually no support for snapback sanctions on Iran, when you have some of the most important transatlantic allies of the United States walking away from our position in the UN, that shows you how important the differences are. On this issue, as a prime example, I don't know how much coordination is being done between the Trump administration and France, but Macron, the French president, has taken a leading role in Lebanon to try to cobble together some sort of transition government that would lead to constitutional reforms and elections. That type of initiative should be supported, but without dictating to the Lebanese what they should do, but facilitating for them their task of putting their own house in order according to what they define as their own needs, not the needs of France or the United States or Russia or Syria or any outside power. So there should be greater coordination there. I think there's room for that. Energy security is a major factor in which we can coordinate much more closely with our European allies. And then Afghanistan. It's important that a coalition of forces that we've had be brought together to assure that Afghanistan never again become a safe haven for groups like Al-Qaeda. And this, to me, is one of the key risks any American president takes. Democratic or Republican, if you're sitting in the Oval Office and you've signed an agreement with the Afghans, and say 2 years later, our intelligence starts reporting that, this Afghan Taliban government, we have information that Al-Qaeda or extremist groups of Al-Taliban, anti-American terrorist groups, have been secreted into the country and are operating out of Afghanistan. That would be a major failure for any administration, because we cannot forget what happened in 9/11. And we can never allow a country like Afghanistan to safe haven terrorists who attack us. So you see, the stakes are very high here, but they're not our stakes alone. They're the stakes of our transatlantic allies. That's why an approach toward the Middle East, to me, we should be having in-depth dialogue at various levels in our leadership in all these countries on an approach to these vital issues. And again, is exemplified by what Lionel Barber told me. What stays in Syria, what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. What happens in Afghanistan doesn't stay in Afghanistan. It can come to haunt us. Refugee outflows, migration, terrorism, assuring the free flow of energy to the world through the Straits of Hormuz, the Gulf of Suez, all of this. These are all still very important issues. Now, the fact that we have become a major producer of oil through our shale revolution makes us more independent in the energy side from the Middle East. But that does not detract from how dependent the world is on the Middle East for global energy markets. So again, we just can't retreat into a wall because we become much more secure. Thank God we become much more secure in terms of energy self-sufficiency. But the United States cannot build a wall around the United States in terms of energy security. It's a global commodity, and it has geopolitical implications.
Mhm. We have a number of questions coming in tying back to the broader question of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And if you could you expand more on this question of what the future holds for the Palestinian leadership? As you mentioned, it's an aging leadership, and the Palestinians are in a difficult position vis-a-vis their relationship with the broader Arab world and the Arab League. What do you see as the future specifically for Palestinian leaders, and how can Palestinians best put a solution forward for, as you mentioned, the fundamental principle of land for peace?
Well, I sense that within the Palestinian community writ large, and you and I, we've gone to Ramallah recently, and we've talked with the Palestinian leadership, and we've talked with the Israeli leadership, and we have a pretty good sense of the situation on the ground. And we talk with Palestinian youth, young people, and there's if I can call it, there's leadership fatigue amongst the Palestinian community, especially the youth, and they've sort of given up hope that the leadership they have will bring forward a future, a viable future for themselves. And that's why I quoted this statistic from Shikaki that these recent polls where Palestinian youth is saying, no, we don't want the creation of yet another Arab autocratic state called Palestine with oligarchs and dictators running us. Let's just go for a one-state solution where we are citizens with the Israelis in one state, but with equal rights. Now, that poses a big problem for the Israeli Zionist dream, because then, with the demographics I've mentioned, that one state will most likely become a majority Palestinian Arab state. And the bad alternative, again, is a apartheid, where you have two classes of citizenship. That's not going to work either, because that's a formula for instability and violence in the future. So this two-state solution is still staring them in the face. And the Palestinian leadership should have come up, when the Trump plan came up, the Trump deal, yes, it did not serve Palestinian interests at all, because it ate away at a viable at the establishment of a viable Palestinian state, especially in terms of territory. But then just don't sit back and complain and reject it. Come forward with your strategy. Come forward and give the parameters of what your framework for an Israeli-Palestinian agreement is, and state it clearly from Ramallah, from the UN podium, and then lobby for it. We don't see any of this. So there's leadership fatigue there, but it's corrosive. And so I don't know, I can't predict what the internal dynamics of Palestinian politics are going to be, but it's a wake-up call.
We have time for one final question, Ambassador, but this will be a question touching on something that you have spoken about through your whole career, and that is the importance of public diplomacy. So even though we are faced with a number of uncertainties with this upcoming election, especially in terms of foreign policy toward the Middle East, how can the U.S., no matter who takes office, still effectively communicate our ideals through our diplomacy in the region?
Well, first, we need to re-energize the Office of Public Diplomacy in the State Department. We created that when I was part of that formation, and we put together a very effective organizational structure. And it started out well, but its role has been diminished. Public diplomacy is not PR. It's not public affairs. It's the ability of a country to convey its strategy, its values, its interests to the global community and to individual countries, and to establish a dialogue. It's very important. And public diplomacy is very important in educating various constituencies about what your policy is. I remember during the many negotiations I was involved in Arab-Israeli peace negotiations, sometimes we, the negotiators, we'd be way out here making progress. And then when the time came for the leaders, Arab and Israeli leaders, to make a decision, they looked back at their shoulders and they saw that public opinion was not with them. The negotiating formula that would be presented to the public was not in accord where public opinion was, and they shied away with coming to a decision. And that's why public diplomacy is such an important arm of diplomacy that we should re-energize it. And I can't underscore its importance.
Well, thank you very much for this address, Ambassador. I think we covered so many important themes in the questions. We wish we had more time to answer all of them, but I will thank all for joining, and I'll also reiterate that this is just one of a series of webinars the Baker Institute will be giving addressing important issues regarding the upcoming election, and we would encourage everyone to visit the Baker Institute's website to look through the work and recent activities of our different centers and programs. So thank you once again, Ambassador.
Thank you, Coach.